From republic to empire ambition, chaos, and the first Caesars. Hey guys, tonight we continue our gentle drift through history, floating from the earliest days of Rome toward the grand, yet oddly tragic, heights of the empire. So dim the lights, settle into your chair, and maybe grab a cup of something warm, because we are about to drift into the peculiar, oddly human, and very messy world of Roman politics. You'll want to keep your eyes half closed for this. It's not exciting, exactly, but it is the kind of history that seeps into your dreams in quiet, ironic ways. So, let's float over to the late Roman Republic. Imagine a city that somehow went from a handful of mud huts to controlling most of the known world, all while arguing over who got to wear the fanciest toga. By the 3rd century BCE, Rome had grown from a modest city-state into a regional powerhouse, largely thanks to an impressive mix of stubbornness, a knack for ruthless diplomacy, and, let's be honest, sheer luck. Their enemies often underestimated them, or were too polite to just finish the job, and Rome capitalized on that repeatedly. By the time of the Punic Wars, Rome was already on a trajectory that would eventually make it the kind of place emperors dream about in nightmares. The First Punic War, mostly a naval affair, lasted 23 years. 23 years. Think about that. Some of the Roman senators probably died halfway through, and new senators had to be briefed on what they were even fighting for. They were mostly fighting Carthage over Sicily, which, in modern terms, is a very long argument about who owns a slightly large island in the Mediterranean. Rome eventually won, mostly by building more ships, losing most of them, building more, losing more, and repeating this cycle until Carthage ran out of patience. Rome gained Sicily, and Carthage, well, they sulked for decades, plotting quietly. Enter Hannibal, the Carthaginian general, with a flair for drama. Now, he doesn't exactly appear in Rome's history with a smile. Instead, he crosses the Alps with elephants, probably thinking, let's make this interesting. Rome, being Rome, panics, runs in circles, and eventually manages to survive the shock of elephants wandering through northern Italy. Hannibal won some battles, yes, but Rome's combination of patience, persistence, and stubborn refusal to surrender kept the city alive. The moral here is simple. Rome could lose spectacularly, but still somehow win in the long run. It's a theme that will follow them for centuries. Fast forward to the late Republic, and we find ourselves in a world where power no longer flows smoothly through old institutions. The Senate, originally a body of wise elders offering guidance, had become, by the 1st century BCE, a sort of elite gossip club with swords. It's in this climate that we meet a few figures whose names you might recognize: Marius, Sulla, Pompey, Crassus, and of course, Julius Caesar. They were ambitious men who took Roman politics seriously, but perhaps not quite seriously enough to avoid civil wars. Gaius Marius, for example, is notable mostly for his military reforms, which allowed the poorest citizens of Rome to enlist in the army. Sounds noble, right? But of course, once you have an army that's loyal to its general rather than the state, you've basically opened the door to decades of civil strife. Marius himself fought Sulla, another general with a fondness for sharp swords and harsh punishments. Sulla eventually marched on Rome itself because why not double down? And became dictator for a while, leaving a trail of proscriptions, or, in other words, very polite lists of people he'd like to see permanently absent from society. This pattern of generals turned politicians became a recurring theme. Pompey the Great was talented, handsome, and, by most accounts, a little too fond of self-promotion. Crassus, famously wealthy, had enough money to fund a small country, which he used to fund wars and influence politics. Julius Caesar, as we all know, is where things get really sticky. He was clever, charming, ambitious, and had a habit of writing his own press releases. Caesar conquered Gaul, writing detailed commentaries about the campaign, essentially telling everyone, yes, I'm brilliant. Also, I killed thousands, but politely. The Roman Senate predictably started to feel a bit jealous, and in 49 BCE, they told Caesar to disband his army and come home. Caesar, not exactly known for loving bureaucracy, crossed the Rubicon, instead a minor river, but historically very symbolic, and marched on Rome. Crossing the Rubicon is now a phrase we use for irreversible decisions. For Caesar, it was mostly a polite way of saying, I'm in charge now, deal with it. This action sparked a civil war, which Caesar eventually won. He became dictator for life because, again, why not? And implemented a series of reforms, some mild, some useful, and some very self-serving. Of course, he didn't live forever. In 44 BCE, on the Ides of March, He was assassinated by a group of senators who probably thought stabbing him 23 times was an effective way to restore the Republic. It wasn't. It just made things messier. Following Caesar's death, we enter the chaotic world of the Second Triumvirate: Octavian, Mark Antony, and Lepidus. Lepidus is mostly forgotten today, which is probably what he wanted. Mark Antony, famous for romance and poor political judgment, falls for Cleopatra, Queen of Egypt. Cleopatra, brilliant, politically savvy, and endlessly patient with men who couldn't quite manage their ambitions, becomes central in this narrative. Meanwhile, Octavian, who later becomes Augustus, quietly consolidates power, outmaneuvering his rivals with patience and subtlety. By 27 BCE, he is declared the first emperor of Rome. The Republic is technically dead, but everyone keeps pretending it's still around. And so begins the Empire, an era where Rome looks fabulous from the outside, with grand buildings, public spectacles, and roads that would shame most modern highways, yet internally is a circus of intrigue, paranoia, and eccentric rulers. Augustus, for example, is remembered as a stabilizer, bringing peace and organization after decades of chaos. Yet, behind the scenes, he was deeply suspicious of almost everyone, and had a habit of quietly removing political threats. His reign sets a tone, outwardly orderly, inwardly anxious, and constantly balancing personal ambition against the supposed needs of the state. From here, we float gently into the Julio-Claudian dynasty. Tiberius, his successor, is a gloomy man with little interest in popularity or social niceties. He retires to Capri later in life and, rumor has it, enjoys the quieter pleasures of island life a little too much, while Rome grows increasingly restless. Caligula, a name that makes people sit up in horror today, was remembered for, well, oddities that ranged from appointing his horse to priestly roles to extravagant spending. Claudius, surprisingly competent despite his awkward public persona and frequent underestimation, conquers Britain. And Nero, the tragic, flamboyant, music-loving, and reputation-obsessed emperor. He famously fiddled or didn't fiddle while parts of Rome burned, though historical accounts are probably exaggerating the musical aspect. Nero's reign ends in suicide, leaving Rome to wonder how things could go so wrong so fast. And this pattern, gently sliding along, continues through the Flavian dynasty and the so-called Five Good Emperors. These were rulers who, for a time, brought relative stability, expanded borders, and focused on governance over personal spectacle. They were productive, efficient, and, most importantly, mostly alive when their reigns ended. But even during these good years, Rome is always quietly teetering. The sheer scale of the empire stretching from Britain to Mesopotamia makes administration awkward. Roads help, but no amount of paving can replace good judgment or curb ambition entirely. By the 3rd century CE, the cracks start to show. Political instability becomes chronic. Emperors rise and fall with alarming frequency, often at the hands of their own troops. The economy strains under the weight of expansion, currency devaluation, and bureaucratic inefficiency. External threats increase. Goths, Vandals, Persians, and various other groups who had patiently waited on Rome's borders for centuries begin poking in more aggressively. And yet, the Romans cling to their identity with remarkable stubbornness, insisting that Rome is eternal, that the empire is invincible, that they are somehow morally superior to all these noisy outsiders. Diocletian, later on, attempts to stabilize the mess by splitting the empire into East and West, delegating authority to make governance more manageable. It works for a while, mainly because he's efficient, ruthless, and deeply committed to controlling chaos. Constantine, later, brings Christianity into the fold, not so much out of spiritual epiphany, but because unifying people under one religion is an effective political tool. Rome is transforming, slowly and inexorably, but its internal weaknesses remain, like cracks in a marble floor hidden under years of dust and decorations. And so, by the 5th century, the Western Roman Empire is a shadow of its former self. Economic troubles, military pressures, and internal decay converge. Rome is sacked multiple times, and eventually, the last emperor, Romulus Augustulus, is deposed in 476 CE. East Rome later, Byzantium continues, but the city we imagine when we say Rome is no longer the same. It's easy to feel a little sentimental here. After all, for nearly 1,200 years, Rome had dominated politics, culture, and war. Now, it's mostly a collection of ruins and faded glories, A cautionary tale wrapped in toga and marble. And that, my friends, is the slow, meandering journey from republic to empire, from the republic's awkward adolescence to the empire's middle-aged overconfidence and eventual decline. It's a story full of ambition, quirks, eccentric rulers, endless Senate debates, and enough irony to lull anyone into a gentle, reflective sleep. Tomorrow, or maybe later tonight if you drift off halfway through, we can float into the darker, more personal eccentricities of later emperors and the East. But for now, just breathe and let the centuries of Rome settle like dust on an old shelf.